Grace Ellery had promised herself she would never move back to Cedar Falls. She'd left at 18 for college and never looked back, building a life in the city that felt, most days, like proof she'd escaped something small and stifling. She never expected the phone call that brought her home would come from a hospice nurse instead of her grandmother herself, and she never expected that the woman who raised her after her parents died would be gone within the week, leaving Grace standing in the doorway of her grandmother's farmhouse with a funeral to plan and a house full of 80 years of memories she wasn't ready to sort through. She found the letter on the third day, tucked inside a hollowed-out edition of her grandmother's favorite gardening book. The paper yellowed with age, the handwriting unfamiliar and unmistakably masculine. It was addressed to her grandmother, dated 52 years earlier, and it was not, Grace realized within the first paragraph, written by the grandfather she'd grown up believing was the only man her grandmother had ever loved. She didn't know yet that this letter would unravel the story of her grandmother's entire life. She didn't know it would lead her to a man named Thomas Whitfield, grandson of the letter's author, who ran the last remaining farm on the road her grandmother had grown up on. And she certainly didn't know that uncovering a 52-year-old love story would become the beginning of writing an entirely new one of her own. Grace had built a life in the city as an archivist for a historical museum, a career that had always struck her family as ironic. A woman who spent her days preserving other people's histories while carefully avoiding her own. She left Cedar Falls at 18 not out of any dramatic rupture, but out of the quiet, persistent feeling that the town had nothing left to offer a girl whose parents had died in a car accident when she was 6, raised afterward by a grandmother who loved her fiercely but carried a grief of her own that Grace had never fully understood. The letter changed the shape of everything she thought she knew. It was written by a man named Walter Whitfield, and it spoke, in careful, restrained prose, of a love affair with her grandmother Eleanor that had apparently unfolded the summer before Eleanor married Grace's grandfather, a summer neither of them, as far as Grace could tell, had ever spoken of again. The letter described a plan to run away together, a promise to meet at the old train depot the following spring, and an ending, devastatingly, that never arrived. The letter itself was never sent, tucked instead into a book Eleanor must have hidden away and, evidently, never opened again in over 5 decades. Grace sat with the letter for a long while, trying to reconcile the woman who'd raised her steady, practical, devoted to a marriage that had, by every appearance, been a happy one with the young woman in the letter, clearly deeply in love with someone who wasn't the man she eventually married. She didn't know what to do with the information, or whether she had any right to go looking for answers to a story her grandmother had chosen, for whatever reason, to leave buried. She went looking anyway, driven by a need she didn't fully understand, to the Whitfield family farm at the edge of town. The only lead the letter provided: a return address scrawled faintly on the back of the envelope. That was where she met Thomas Whitfield, Walter's grandson, a man in his mid-30s who'd taken over the family farm after his own father's declining health made the decision for him, giving up an engineering career in Denver he rarely spoke about with anyone in town. "I'm looking for information about your grandfather," Grace said, standing awkwardly at the farm's front gate, the letter clutched in her hand like evidence in a case she wasn't sure she was allowed to investigate. "Walter Whitfield. I think he might have known my grandmother, Eleanor Ellery, a long time ago." Thomas's expression shifted at the name, something careful and curious crossing his face. "My grandfather talked about an Eleanor exactly once, when I was a teenager, right before he died." Said it with this look on his face like it still hurt, 50 years later. "I always wondered who she was." He never said more than the name. There had been a particular ritual Grace remembered from childhood without ever understanding its weight. Until now, every spring, without fail, her grandmother would spend a full afternoon in the garden alone, refusing help, emerging hours later quieter than usual, a mood that would linger for a day or two before fading back into her normal warmth. Grace had always assumed it was simply gardening, or perhaps some private grief about her late husband. Rereading the letter now, cross-referencing the date against her own childhood memories, she realized with a small, aching clarity that the ritual had always fallen during the exact week the letter proposed. For the depot meeting, a private, unspoken anniversary her grandmother had kept alone for 52 years, never once explaining it to anyone. I think she never stopped thinking about it, Grace told Thomas, once she'd made the connection, sharing the memory with him on the porch one afternoon. Every single spring, she never said a word to me about why, and I never thought to ask, because it just seemed like part of who she was. I wonder now how much of her whole life was built around a grief she never let anyone see. My grandfather was the same way with the depot, Thomas said, consistent almost to the point of ritual. I used to tease him about it when I was a teenager, ask him why he kept driving out to some abandoned platform every year. He'd just say, "Some things deserve remembering." Even when they didn't work out, I didn't understand it then. I think I'm starting to now. They sat together on the farmhouse porch that afternoon, Grace reading the letter aloud for the first time, both of them absorbing the shape of a love story neither had known existed. Buried in two separate families' histories for over half a century, Thomas listened with the particular stillness of a man hearing a piece of his own family story finally make sense. His grandfather's occasional, unexplained melancholy every spring, a habit of visiting the old train depot every year on an anniversary he never named, a marriage to Thomas's grandmother that Thomas had always sensed was fond but never quite as alive as the stories Walter told about his younger years. He used to take my grandmother flowers every spring, Thomas said slowly, piecing it together as he spoke. Same week every year without fail. I always assumed it was some anniversary of theirs. I don't think it was. The letter says they were supposed to meet at the train depot the following spring, Grace said, but it was never sent. I don't understand why. Did something happen to keep them apart? Neither of them had an answer yet, and the not knowing became its own kind of connection, the two of them meeting several more times over the following weeks, piecing together fragments from old family letters, photographs, and the memories of the few remaining old-timers in Cedar Falls who might remember anything about that particular summer. 52 years earlier, it became, without either of them quite planning it, an excuse to spend time together that neither wanted to examine too closely. The investigation into their grandparents' unfinished love story slowly becoming the foundation of something unfinished and new between them. I think I know what happened, Grace said one evening, 3 weeks into their search, holding a newspaper clipping she'd found in her grandmother's old keepsake box, an obituary for Eleanor's older sister, dated the same spring the letter promised the depot meeting, dead of a sudden illness that had apparently required Eleanor to stay home and help her grieving parents run the family farm rather than run away with the man she loved. My grandmother's sister died right before she was supposed to meet your grandfather. I think she felt like she couldn't leave her parents alone with that grief. I think she chose duty over the letter and never told anyone why, because it probably felt like an impossible thing to explain. And by the time the grief passed, maybe it was easier to just move forward with the life she'd already built, Thomas said quietly. My grandfather never married until 3 years after that, from what my father told me. I always thought it was just because he was particular. Maybe he was waiting, without knowing what he was waiting for a woman who'd already decided she couldn't come. Grace spent the following days combing through more of her grandmother's belongings with fresh eyes, finding small clues she'd overlooked before a pressed flower tucked into an old Bible, matching the description of the wildflowers Walter had written about in his letter. A faded photograph of a young Eleanor standing near the train depot, dated the same spring, her smile in the photo brighter and more unguarded than in any picture Grace had ever seen of her grandmother as an adult. It was strange and moving in equal measure. Discovering an entire hidden dimension to a woman Grace thought she'd known completely. Learning that even the people closest to us carry rooms we never get invited into. I keep wondering if she regretted it, Grace admitted to Thomas one afternoon, turning the old photograph over in her hands. Whether some part of her spent her whole marriage wishing she'd chosen differently. I don't think it has to be that simple, Thomas said. Maybe she loved my grandfather deeply, in the way that letter describes, and also built a genuinely good life with your grandfather afterward. People aren't always choosing between a real love and a fake one. Sometimes they're choosing between two different real things, and one of them just happens to come with an ending that never got to play out. The near kiss happened that same evening, the two of them sitting close on the porch swing where Walter must have once sat with his own grief, the newspaper clipping between them like a small, solved mystery neither of them fully wanted to close, because closing it meant the reason for their frequent meetings would disappear too. Thomas reached over to take her hand, and for a long, suspended moment, the space between them narrowed into something that had nothing to do with grandparents or old letters at all. Then Thomas's phone buzzed with an urgent call from his farmhand about a fence break, letting the cattle loose, and the moment scattered into practical chaos. Though neither of them quite let go of what had almost happened, the complication arrived a week later, when Grace's boss called from the city, informing her that the museum had an unexpected opening for a senior archivist position, the exact promotion she'd been quietly hoping for over the past 2 years, requiring her to return to the city within the month if she wanted it. It should have been an easy decision. Instead, Grace found herself standing in her grandmother's kitchen, staring at the promotion email, feeling something that looked disturbingly like grief at the idea of leaving Cedar Falls now that she'd finally started, for the first time since she was 18, to feel like she understood exactly why her grandmother had loved this town and this life, complicated as it turned out to be. You should take it, Thomas said, when she told him, his voice carefully, even in a way that told her exactly how much it was costing him to say it. It's the job you've wanted for years. I'm not going to be the reason you don't take something you've worked so hard for. It's not that simple, Grace admitted. A month ago, I would have taken that job without a second thought. But I came here to bury my grandmother, and instead I found this whole other story about her life, and about your family, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, I found this, you, and I don't know how to just go back to my old life like none of it happened. Grace spent several days wrestling with the decision, torn between the career she'd built and the unexpected, terrifying pull of a life she was only beginning to imagine in Cedar Falls. She thought about her grandmother, about the choice Eleanor had made 52 years earlier, duty over desire, safety over an uncertain love, and about the quiet melancholy that had apparently followed Walter Whitfield for the rest of his life, missing a meeting he never got the chance to keep. She didn't want to spend the next 50 years wondering what might have happened if she'd chosen differently. She found Thomas at the farm's old train depot, the very one from the letter, still standing at the edge of town though it had been decommissioned decades earlier. The platform overgrown but the building itself somehow still standing, a quiet monument to a meeting that never happened. Thomas was there for reasons of his own, she realized when she arrived, visiting the spot on an impulse he couldn't quite explain, some inherited pull toward the place his grandfather had visited every spring for reasons Thomas had only just come to understand. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the gravel, something in his expression shifting from surprise to a cautious, hopeful stillness, as though he'd been half expecting her without quite letting himself believe it. I turned down the promotion, Grace said, before he could ask. I called the museum yesterday. I'm staying in Cedar Falls. I'm taking over my grandmother's house instead of selling it. and I've actually been offered a position helping the county historical society catalog the town's archives, which is honestly probably a better fit for me than I ever admitted to myself in the city. That's not a small thing to walk away from, Thomas said, though something in his expression had already begun softening into disbelieving hope. You spend years building toward that promotion. I know, Grace said, and for a long time, I thought that career was the whole point, proof that I'd built a life bigger than the one I left behind in Cedar Falls. But sorting through my grandmother's whole hidden history this past month, I kept thinking about what actually mattered to her. Underneath all the practical decisions she made, it wasn't the farm or the reputation or even the marriage exactly. It was the people she let herself really love, even when loving them cost her something. I don't want to build a life around avoiding cost anymore, Thomas. I want to build one around who and what I actually love. No, Grace agreed, but neither is this. She gestured at the old depot, at the platform where two people 52 years ago never got the chance to meet, at the entire unlikely story that had brought her and Thomas together in the wreckage of it. I came here to bury my grandmother, and I found out she spent her whole life quietly grieving, a choice she made when she was young and scared and didn't think she had another option. I don't want to make the same choice, Thomas. I don't want to be 70 years old, wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed. He closed the distance between them then, right there on the overgrown platform where his grandfather had waited every spring for a woman who never came, and when he kissed her, it felt like something finally, quietly completing itself, not undoing the sadness of what Walter and Eleanor lost, but honoring it by choosing deliberately not to repeat it. Somewhere overhead, a train whistle sounded faintly in the distance from the still active line a few miles east, an echo of the very sound that must have once carried Walter's hope every spring he stood in this exact spot, and neither of them could help but smile at the strange, fitting timing of it. I keep thinking about my grandfather standing here, year after year, Thomas admitted, his forehead resting against hers. I used to think it was just a sad habit, an old man holding on to something that was already gone. I think now it was something else. He never stopped believing love like that was worth showing up for, even when showing up meant just standing on an empty platform, alone, hoping. I don't want to just hope anymore. Grace, I want to actually have this. He paused, glancing around at the overgrown platform, the weathered depot sign still faintly legible after all these years. Strange, isn't it? Two families, two letters that never quite reached where they were supposed to go, and somehow it still led here, to us, standing in exactly the spot he waited in. Then let's have it, Grace said. Let's actually meet at the depot this time. They stood there a long while, the late afternoon light slanting gold across the overgrown platform. Two people who might never have met at all if a letter hadn't been hidden inside a gardening book for 52 years, waiting for exactly the right granddaughter to find it. A year later, Grace had settled fully into her grandmother's farmhouse, now converted into a small archive and reading room where she cataloged Cedar Falls local history alongside her new role at the County Historical Society. The letter itself framed and displayed with careful, loving context, not as a tragedy, but as the beginning of a story that had simply taken 52 years and two different generations to finally reach its ending. She'd added, beside the letter, a small placard she'd written herself, explaining briefly the story of Walter and Eleanor, and beneath it, a second, newer photograph herself and Thomas standing at the old depot. The first entry in what she liked to think of as a continuation rather than a replacement. Thomas's farm thrived alongside her efforts, the two properties functioning in practice as one shared life the way Walter and Eleanor's never got the chance to become. His father, initially skeptical of a relationship born out of what seemed at first like an odd historical curiosity, came around fully once he saw the genuine partnership the two had built, telling Thomas at their engagement party the following winter that his own father, Walter, would have found something fitting, even funny, in the idea that the granddaughter of the woman he lost eventually became the reason his own grandson found something even better than what almost was. Grace's own extended family, scattered and distant since her grandmother's passing, slowly began reconnecting too, drawn back to Cedar Falls by the story of the letter, several cousins reaching out for the first time in years, simply to hear the full account of what, every spring, on the same week Walter used to visit the depot alone, Grace and Thomas walked out together instead, flowers in hand, honoring the love story that never got its ending by finally, deliberately giving it one. The old platform, still overgrown but no longer forgotten, had become something of a local landmark by then, a modest sign near the entrance explaining its history, for the handful of visitors curious enough to ask, a small, quiet monument to the particular kind of love that waits 52 years to find its way home. Grace liked to think that somewhere, in whatever way such things might be true, Eleanor and Walter knew the ending had finally arrived, not for them, but for the two people who'd carried their unfinished story forward into something whole.